The prestigious tailoring establishment of Monsieur Laurent Dupont was the epitome of elegance on Savile Row. It was not uncommon to see the great and good of London society frequenting the shop, their aspirations to sartorial excellence resting in the capable hands of Monsieur Dupont. The man himself was a figure of refined taste, tall, with silver hair brushed immaculately back, and a penchant for impeccably pressed morning coats. One Wednesday afternoon in late spring, as the city bustled with activity, Monsieur Dupont was found lying face down on the polished oak floor of his workshop, a pair of gleaming tailor's shears protruding from his back. The gas lamps flickered ominously, when the subtle scent of lavender, the tailor's signature touch, hung in the air. It was Inspector Japp who first surveyed the scene, his square jaw set in a grim line. "Stabbed from behind," he muttered, noting the splatter of blood on the russet rug. "No signs of a struggle." Japp eyed the shears with a frown. "Nasty business." The police were already speaking to the few witnesses present. A seamstress, a client picking up his suit, and Dupont's business partner, Geoffrey Haywood. Haywood was a gaunt man with thinning blonde hair, his fingers twitching as he spoke. He was working on a commission for Lady Winthrop," Haywood stammered. "A ceremonial uniform. Said he wanted to be left alone to finish the final adjustments." Japp gave a curt nod. "And did anyone go into the workshop after that?" The seamstress, Clara Baines, a timid woman of about 25, glanced up. I heard raised voices, Inspector. But it's not unusual. Monsieur Dupont was very particular. Sometimes he lost his temper." "Did you recognize the other voice?" Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to Haywood, who shook his head subtly. "No, sir, I didn't hear enough to tell." Japp rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "And you, Mr. Haywood?" Haywood looked flustered. "I was in the front checking our ledger. I heard nothing until Clara screamed." It was then that the soft patter of elegant shoes on the polished floor announced the arrival of Hercule Poirot. The little Belgian detective took in the room with a single, discerning glance. "Ah, Japp," he greeted warmly. "A tragic affair, no?" He straightened his tie meticulously. "May I observe?" Japp nodded. "Be my guest, Poirot. It's a puzzler, this one." Poirot bent over the body, noting the angle of the shears and the untouched workbench nearby. He pointed to the victim's sleeves. "Regardez, Japp. The cuffs, they are unfinished. A perfectionist like Monsieur Dupont would never leave such a detail incomplete, especially on a commission for Lady Winthrop. And yet, he is interrupted, fatally so." Japp raised an eyebrow. "You think someone forced their way in?" Poirot pursed his lips. "Possibly. But more importantly, who would dare to interrupt such a man? At his craft? It suggests familiarity or urgency." He glanced around the room, his gaze settling on Haywood, who had begun to sweat profusely. "Monsieur Haywood, you say you were checking the ledger. May I see it?" Haywood handed over the ledger reluctantly. Poirot flicked through it with deft precision, his keen eyes narrowing. He tapped a recent entry. "An appointment with a Mr. Charles Brighton at 3 Rousseau. Tell me, was he seen today?" Clara looked uncertain. No, Monsieur Poirot. Mr. Brighton never arrived. Monsieur Dupont was cross about it." Poirot's eyes glimmered with intrigue. "Ah, a client who fails to appear, a craftsman who dies with unfinished work, and voices raised in conflict. Très intéressant." Japp frowned. "You think this Brighton might have something to do with it?" Poirot raised a finger. "Let us not rush to conclusions, my friend. Hastings would remind you of my caution. Let us first examine the craftsmanship, both of the crime and the victim's last task. I believe Monsieur Dupont's art may hold a clue." Poirot's gaze fell once more on the half-finished uniform, his thoughts already weaving the first threads of a theory. Poirot straightened, his eyes lingering on the polished workbench, its surface meticulously arranged, a testament to Dupont's fastidious nature. A small notebook lay beside a folded tape measure and a row of finely honed scissors, each arranged by size. He reached for the notebook, its cover bearing the initials LD in gilt script. Flipping it open, Poirot scanned the most recent entries, his eyebrows arching as he paused on a hurried scrawl. 2nd May, 3 p.m. See Brighton. Uniform adjustments. Poirot's gaze flicked to the ornate wall clock. It was just past 4. "Monsieur Haywood," he said, his voice measured, "you said you heard nothing until the scream. Were you in the front the entire time?" Haywood's eyes darted nervously to Clara, who shrank back. "Yes. Yes, of course. I was reviewing accounts." Poirot's lips twitched, "And yet you allowed the cries of an argument to go uninvestigated?" "Curious." Haywood's face flushed. I thought it was simply one of Dupont's rants. He could be difficult." Poirot took a measured step closer, his small patent leather shoes whispering against the polished floor. "Difficult? But I think it was more than that. A man is dead, and yet you, his business partner, show only the slightest concern. You will permit me to say that it is odd, n'est-ce pas?" Before Haywood could respond, the shop door chimed as it swung open, revealing a tall, barrel-chested man with a military bearing and a trim, graying mustache. He paused on the threshold, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as he took in the assembled scene. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, his voice clipped and precise. "I was told Monsieur Dupont required my presence this afternoon." Poirot's eyes brightened. "Ah, you must be Colonel Charles Brighton. Do come in, Colonel." Brighton's gaze moved to the lifeless form of Dupont, his brow furrowing. "Good God! Is that—" Poirot held up a hand. "Oui, Monsieur Dupont is dead. Stabbed, I regret to say, with his own shears." He stepped back, allowing the Colonel a clearer view of the body. "And yet you were expected at 3 o'clock for a fitting, were you not?" Brighton's jaw tightened. "Yes, though I arrived a bit late. My driver was delayed by a traffic snarl near Piccadilly. I stepped in just as the young lady screamed." He gestured to Clara, who shuddered slightly under his intense gaze. Poirot noted the Colonel's calm demeanor, his military poise intact even in the face of death. "You heard nothing before that?" Brighton's eyes narrowed. "No. I found the door to the workshop ajar and stepped in, only to find this scene of chaos." He exhaled sharply, his nostrils flaring. Terrible business. Dupont was a fine craftsman, a stickler for detail. "Indeed," Poirot replied, his eyes drifting to the unfinished ceremonial uniform on the workbench. "And may I ask, what was the nature of this uniform?" Brighton straightened, his shoulders stiff. "A formal mess uniform, for a ceremony next month. Dupont had been adjusting the cuffs. He insisted on perfection, you know." Poirot's gaze lingered on the unfinished sleeves, the threads trailing like tiny, neglected secrets. He turned back to Brighton. "Did you quarrel with Monsieur Dupont, Colonel?" Brighton's mouth set in a firm line. "Certainly not. Dupont was an exacting man, but I respected his work. I would not raise my voice to him over a matter of tailoring." Poirot's eyes glinted, the first hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Ah, but you are a military man, accustomed to command and discipline. It would take much to provoke you, no?" Brighton's jaw tightened again, but he said nothing. Poirot turned to Haywood, who had been edging slowly toward the door, his nervous hands twisting the cuffs of his own coat. "Monsieur Haywood, you appear eager to depart, yet I have not finished with you." Haywood froze, his pallor deepening. Poirot's tone remained light, almost conversational. "Tell me, was Monsieur Dupont ever in financial difficulty? Did the business struggle?" Haywood swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "We had disagreements, yes. Dupont was extravagant. He demanded only the finest materials, which, while impressive, were costly. But he insisted our clients expected nothing less." Poirot tapped the leather cover of the notebook. and yet a man so particular, so proud, would not tolerate unfinished work. Do you see the inconsistency? Japp cleared his throat, his pen poised above his notepad. What are you getting at, Poirot? Poirot did not immediately answer. Instead, he walked to the row of meticulously arranged scissors and selected a small, sharp pair. He held them up, turning them in the light. This workshop is a place of precision, of control, everything in its place, yet our victim was found on the floor, his life ended with the very tools of his craft. He set the scissors back in their place, his expression unreadable. Poirot turned to face the small group, his eyes sharp and unblinking. I suspect our Monsieur Dupont knew something, a secret perhaps, that someone found too dangerous to leave unspoken, and like a misaligned stitch, this secret threatened to unravel all. The room fell into a tense silence, the ticking of the ornate wall clock the only sound as Poirot's sharp eyes drifted from face to face, noting every flicker of fear, every nervous glance, every slight twitch of guilt. "Mais oui," he murmured to himself, straightening his cuffs. "There is much still hidden here." Poirot's gaze lingered on Haywood for a fraction longer before he stepped back, his mind already weaving together the first threads of a most intriguing puzzle. Poirot's keen eyes continued to roam the workshop, absorbing every detail as Japp motioned for a pair of constables to photograph the scene. Haywood, still trembling, attempted to slip behind the heavy velvet curtain separating the front showroom from the workshop, but Poirot's voice halted him. "Ah, Monsieur Haywood, a moment, if you please," Poirot said, his tone polite but unmistakably firm. "You mentioned disagreements over finances. Tell me, did these disputes ever escalate?" Haywood hesitated, his lips parting in a desperate search for the right words. No, not precisely. Dupont was a perfectionist, you see. He believed that reputation was worth more than profit. He had grand ideas, but he lacked business sense. Poirot stepped closer, the faint scent of his lemon-scented pomade mingling with the lavender that clung to the workshop's fabric-draped walls. And yet, despite his extravagance, Monsieur Dupont's name remains a mark of the highest quality. One must wonder, Monsieur Haywood, why a business so revered would have financial strain. Haywood's jaw tightened. "What are you suggesting?" Poirot's eyes sparkled. "I suggest nothing, my friend. I merely observe." He turned to Clara, who had taken a nervous step back, her small frame dwarfed by the heavy bolts of fabric that lined the workshop shelves. "Mademoiselle Baines, you said you heard raised voices earlier. Are you quite certain you did not recognize the other speaker?" Clara's cheeks flushed, her eyes darting to the blood-stained floor. I don't know, Monsieur Poirot. I was in the front, pressing collars. The sound was muffled." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Muffled, you say? As if the door was closed?" Clara blinked, clearly caught off guard. Yes, I suppose so. The door to the workroom is thick, and Monsieur Dupont always kept it shut when he was focused." Poirot gave a small, approving nod. "Très bien. That is most revealing." He let the silence hang for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the nervous gathering. Colonel Brighton, who had been shifting impatiently near the doorway, cleared his throat. "If you're quite finished, Monsieur Poirot, I must return to my duties. I had no quarrel with the man, and I hardly see how I'm connected to this tragedy." Poirot turned, his eyes settling on the Colonel with a gaze sharp enough to cut the thickest wool. "Colonel, may I ask, did you notice anything amiss upon entering the workshop? Anything out of place, perhaps?" Brighton straightened, his military bearing reasserting itself. "No, nothing of the sort. As I said, I arrived late. I found the door ajar and stepped inside, only to see this—" He gestured to the prone body of Dupont, "and hear the young woman scream." Poirot's head tilted slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Curious. You arrived late, you say, and yet the ledger shows your appointment as having been set for precisely 3 o'clock. Tell me, did you inform Monsieur Dupont of this delay?" Brighton's brows drew together, a flicker of confusion passing over his stern features. No, I had no means to do so. The delay was unavoidable. Poirot's eyes glinted with a hint of mischief. And yet a man so precise as Monsieur Dupont, a man who insisted on punctuality, would surely have noted your absence. Indeed, it might even have caused him distress, no? Brighton's mouth tightened. I cannot account for the man's emotions, Monsieur Poirot. I merely arrived as soon as I could. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes drifting once more to the blood-stained shears. Of course. And yet, there is something that troubles me. A small detail, but a significant one. Japp, who had been listening intently, leaned in. Go on, Poirot. What detail? Poirot smiled, the corners of his mustache twitching. It is the shears, mon ami. Notice the angle, the depth of the wound. It suggests not a sudden strike, but a precise thrust, perhaps even by someone accustomed to the delicate work of tailoring. Haywood's face turned ashen, his hand gripping the back of a nearby chair for support. Clara's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. Brighton's expression remained impassive, but his shoulders stiffened slightly. Poirot continued, his voice dropping to a soft murmur that nonetheless cut through the tense air. And consider, too, the matter of the unfinished uniform. Dupont was a man who prided himself on his craftsmanship. For him to leave a piece incomplete, to abandon his work without cause, that too is a small but significant clue. He turned, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. I believe that someone here knows more than they admit. Someone, perhaps, who had a private word with Monsieur Dupont before the fatal moment. A word that led to violence. A thick silence fell over the workshop, the faint ticking of the wall clock marking each passing second. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, his eyes gleaming with the quiet satisfaction of a hunter who has just picked up the scent of his prey. Mais oui, he said softly, as if to himself. The threads are beginning to align. Now it is only a matter of following them to their inevitable conclusion. He turned abruptly, his eyes locking with Japp's. Come, my friend. Let us examine the front showroom. I believe we shall find our next clue there. Without waiting for a response, Poirot strode purposefully through the velvet curtain, his sharp footsteps echoing against the polished floorboards, leaving the small group behind in a state of uneasy silence. Poirot stepped into the front showroom, his sharp eyes immediately taking in the rich hues of tailored suits hanging from brass racks. Each piece a silent testament to the craftsmanship that had made Laurent Dupont a sought-after name in London's high society. The air here was cooler, the faint scent of lavender mingling with the crisp aroma of freshly pressed wool. The thick velvet curtain behind him rustled as Japp followed, his heavy footsteps a stark contrast to Poirot's light, precise tread. Poirot paused, his gaze settling on the tall, gilt-framed mirror near the fitting pedestal. The reflection showed his small, perfectly groomed figure, his head slightly tilted as he considered the scene. He noted the array of full-length mirrors, each angled carefully to capture every aspect of a client's attire, and the low leather chairs positioned for comfort during fittings. He moved toward the wide oak counter where the ledgers rested, their pages filled with the precise, looping script of Monsieur Dupont. Poirot's fingers hovered over the open book, his eyes tracing the last few entries. Curious, he murmured, tapping the edge of the page. The entry for Colonel Brighton at 3 o'clock is here, as we noted. But look, there is another entry, immediately following it. 4 p.m. R. Everly. Japp peered over his shoulder. Everly? That name wasn't mentioned by anyone back there. Who's this Everly, then? Poirot's eyes sparkled. An excellent question, my dear Japp. Perhaps this is a client who was expected but has not yet appeared. Or perhaps... He trailed off, his gaze drifting toward the shop's polished front door, the glass inset reflecting the late afternoon light. Poirot straightened, his gaze sharpening as he noticed a faint, scuffed mark on the polished wood near the threshold. He crouched, his sharp eyes examining the thin, irregular scratch just inside the door frame, where the edge of the door had scraped against the floor. He reached out, his fingers brushing the groove, his expression thoughtful. Japp leaned in, his brow furrowed. "What is it, Poirot? Just a scratch, isn't it?" Poirot straightened, his eyes still on the door. "Oui, a scratch, but not a recent one. See here, polished over as if someone wished to conceal it. Yet it is precisely this detail that reveals much." Japp blinked. "How so?" Poirot's lips quirked upward. "A door that scrapes suggests it has been forced, perhaps by someone in haste, or someone not concerned with maintaining the fine finish of this establishment. But why force the door of a shop that prides itself on its exclusivity?" He turned, his gaze settling on the counter once more. He stepped behind it, his fingers tracing the neat stacks of receipts, swatches of fabric, and small leather-bound notebooks. His eyes brightened as he picked up a slip of paper, its edge slightly frayed. "Ah, what have we here?" Poirot unfolded the paper carefully, his eyes narrowing as he read the neatly written lines. It was a bill of sale, dated the previous week, for a set of brass cufflinks engraved with the initials R.E. Japp grunted, his expression puzzled. "You think this Everleigh character was here recently?" Poirot's gaze grew distant, his mind racing through the implications. "It is a possibility, mon ami. Consider, Monsieur Dupont, a man of precision and discipline, keeps his records meticulously. If he scheduled an appointment with this R. Everleigh, then it suggests a relationship of some importance, yet we have heard no mention of this name from his staff." Japp straightened, his jaw tightening. "You think this Everleigh might be our killer?" Poirot folded the paper with a delicate touch, slipping it into his waistcoat pocket. "Perhaps, or perhaps he's merely another thread in the fabric of this mystery, but I suspect we shall find our answers soon enough." At that moment, the front door swung open with a sharp chime, and a tall, elegantly dressed woman swept into the showroom, her dark hair pinned back beneath a stylish cloche hat. She paused, her eyes narrowing as she took in the two men. "Ah, Lady Winthrop," Poirot said smoothly, stepping forward with a slight bow. "We were just speaking of you." The woman's perfectly arched brows lifted in surprise. "Of me, Monsieur Poirot? How intriguing. I was merely stopping by to see if my husband's ceremonial uniform was ready for collection." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Indeed? Then you have not heard the tragic news." Lady Winthrop's gloved hand rose to her mouth, her eyes widening. "News? What news?" Poirot's tone softened, though his sharp eyes never left her face. "I regret to inform you, madame, that Monsieur Dupont has been killed." Lady Winthrop's face paled beneath her flawless makeup, her lips parting in a small, silent gasp. She clutched the edge of the counter for support, her polished nails digging into the oak. "Killed? But that is impossible. Who would do such a thing?" Poirot's head tilted slightly, his gaze piercing. "Ah, that is precisely what we are here to discover. Tell me, Lady Winthrop, was your husband acquainted with Monsieur Dupont?" Lady Winthrop blinked rapidly, her composure fraying at the edges. "Of course. My husband insists on only the finest attire. Dupont has tailored his uniforms for years." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And did your husband have any quarrel with Monsieur Dupont? Any dispute, perhaps, over the recent commission?" The woman's mouth tightened, a faint line appearing between her perfectly arched brows. "Not that I am aware of. My husband is a military man, Monsieur Poirot. He values discipline and precision, much like Dupont himself." Poirot's gaze remained steady. "And yet, even the most disciplined men can be provoked, can they not?" Lady Winthrop's eyes flicked to the door, her body tensing as if considering a swift exit. Poirot noted the subtle shift, the slight quiver in her gloved hands. "Madame," Poirot said gently, leaning in, "I believe you know more than you are saying. Perhaps it is time you shared your thoughts." Lady Winthrop's breath caught, her eyes wide, as if the small Belgian detective had stripped away her polished exterior to reveal the secrets beneath. Poirot straightened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "After all, madame, a stitch out of place can unravel an entire garment." Lady Winthrop's gloved fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, her eyes flicking to the side as if calculating her next move. Poirot, his own hands clasped neatly before him, tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. He noted the slight tremor in her lips, the way her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. A woman accustomed to control, now suddenly unmoored. "Madame," Poirot said gently, stepping closer, "I understand that this news must be a shock. But you see, there are whispers already, murmurs of secrets and shadows in the corners of this fine establishment. And when such secrets stir, they often bring with them the sharp sting of regret." Lady Winthrop's eyes darted toward the fitting rooms, her dark lashes fluttering like a startled bird's wings. She straightened, her chin lifting with a hint of defiance. I do not know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. My husband and I have nothing to hide." Poirot's gaze remained steady, his expression almost sympathetic. "Of course, madame. And yet, consider this. Monsieur Dupont, a man of impeccable discipline and precision, is found dead in his own workshop, his final work left unfinished, his perfect order shattered. It suggests a disruption, a sudden break in his routine. You understand, I think, that such a break rarely occurs without cause." Lady Winthrop hesitated, her gloved hands trembling slightly as they clutched the edge of the counter. But I know nothing of his affairs. My husband merely ordered his ceremonial uniform as he has done for years." Poirot inclined his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And this uniform, did your husband express any dissatisfaction with it? Any complaint that might have led to a disagreement?" The woman's jaw tightened, a faint flush creeping beneath her carefully applied rouge. "No, of course not. My husband values tradition and discipline. He respects Dupont's work." Poirot took a small step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. But madame, I suspect there is more. You see, a relationship with one's tailor is often more than mere commerce. It is a matter of trust, of shared confidences. Did Monsieur Dupont, perhaps, know something of your husband's affairs that you would prefer remain hidden? Lady Winthrop's eyes flared, a sharp intake of breath escaping her lips. She opened her mouth to protest, but the sound of the shop door chiming cut her short. All eyes turned as a tall, angular man with sharp cheekbones and thinning blonde hair stepped into the showroom, his eyes narrowing at the tense scene before him. The man hesitated for only a fraction of a second before striding forward, his thin lips pressing into a tight line. "Is there a problem here?" Lady Winthrop's eyes widened, and for a brief moment Poirot saw a flash of something, relief perhaps, or fear, as she turned to face the newcomer. "Richard, I did not expect you." The man's sharp gaze flicked from his wife to Poirot, then to Jap, whose thick, muscular frame seemed to bristle at the sudden intrusion. Poirot's eyes brightened. And you must be Everly, no?" The man stiffened, his jaw clenching for a heartbeat before he gave a curt nod. "Yes, Richard Everly. And you are?" Poirot offered a small, polite bow. "Hercule Poirot, at your service." He straightened, his eyes glittering with sharp interest. "May I ask, Monsieur Everly, what brings you to Dupont's establishment this afternoon?" Everly's eyes flicked to the ledger on the counter, his expression tightening. "I had an appointment, as you no doubt have already discovered." Poirot's mustache twitched. "Indeed, we did note your entry, Monsieur Everly. 4 o'clock, if I am not mistaken. Yet you find yourself arriving somewhat later, n'est-ce pas?" Everly's thin lips pressed together, his eyes narrowing. "Traffic. It cannot be helped." Poirot's eyes sparkled. "Of course. The streets of London are ever unpredictable. And yet I wonder, did you have occasion to see Monsieur Dupont before his unfortunate demise? Everley hesitated, his sharp gaze flicking to Lady Winthrop, who had taken a small, involuntary step back. "No," he replied, his voice growing colder. "I arrived to find this commotion. I was merely coming to collect a few items I had ordered." Poirot's head tilted slightly. "Ah, the brass cufflinks, perhaps, engraved with the initials R.E. Everley's eyes widened, his body tensing. "Yes. How did you—" Poirot held up a hand, his eyes twinkling. "You must forgive me, monsieur. I'm a man of observation, and these small details often speak to me with surprising clarity." Jap, who had been watching the exchange with growing suspicion, stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared. "And what's your connection to Dupont, then? Just a client, or something more?" Everley's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring slightly. "I have no connection beyond business. Dupont was my tailor. Nothing more." Poirot's eyes remained locked on Everley's face, noting the slight pulse at his temple, the quickened breath beneath his crisply starched collar. "And yet you linger, Monsieur Everley, even as the shadow of murder hangs over this place. One might think you have a reason to remain, no?" Everley's face hardened, his eyes flicking to Lady Winthrop once more. "If you have questions, Monsieur Poirot, I suggest you ask them plainly." Poirot's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Ah, monsieur, but I believe the answers are already present, if one knows where to look. And I suspect you, and perhaps others, know more than you are willing to say." For a moment, the small shop seemed to hold its breath, the polished mannequins standing as silent witnesses to the tension crackling in the air. Poirot, his keen eyes darting between Everley and Lady Winthrop, felt the threads of his investigation tightening, drawing the circle ever closer to the truth. And in the quiet, polished heart of Dupont's showroom, the first stitch in the unraveling tapestry had been set. Poirot allowed the silence to linger, his sharp eyes flicking between Lady Winthrop and Richard Everley, the tension between them palpable. Jap shifted beside him, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the polished floorboards. Everley's jaw remained clenched, his thin lips pressed into a tight line, while Lady Winthrop's gloved hands trembled faintly, betraying a nerve less steady than she wished to convey. Poirot took a slow step back, his small, precise shoes tapping softly against the polished oak. He straightened, adjusting his cuffs with the delicate care of a man who prized order above all things. "Monsieur Everley," he began, his tone polite yet firm, "you say that you had only a business relationship with Monsieur Dupont, yet you arrive at this shop mere minutes after his death, unannounced and with a demeanor that suggests more than mere curiosity. You see, it strikes me as odd that a man of your bearing would involve himself in the affairs of a murdered tailor unless something more compelling drew you here." Everley's nostrils flared slightly, his sharp eyes darting to Lady Winthrop, who had taken a small, unsteady step back, her gaze fixed on the floor. He opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot raised a finger, silencing him with a small, knowing smile. "Permit me to be clear," Poirot continued, his voice dropping to a soft, almost conspiratorial tone. "Monsieur Dupont, a man known for his discretion and precision, is found dead, his lifeblood spilled across his own workshop. His final creation, a ceremonial uniform, left incomplete on his cutting table. Yet you, a man whose initials match those engraved upon a set of custom cufflinks recently ordered, appear at his establishment at the precise moment of crisis. Tell me, monsieur, is this merely a coincidence, or is there more beneath the surface?" Everley's jaw tightened, his thin frame drawing up as if preparing for a blow. "You presume too much, Monsieur Poirot. I have no part in this madness." Poirot's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing. But you see, I do not presume, I observe, and what I observe is a man attempting to distance himself from a scene he cannot fully abandon." Tell me, Monsieur Everly, when was the last time you saw Monsieur Dupont alive? Everly's thin lips pressed together, a muscle jumping at his temple. 2 days ago. I came for a fitting, nothing more. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, but that is most curious. For when I examined the workroom earlier, I noted a length of fine military-grade braid laid out upon the cutting table, an embellishment most commonly found on ceremonial uniforms. Yet this braid bore the faintest trace of cigarette ash, a detail out of place in the pristine world of Monsieur Dupont. You, I believe, are a smoker, are you not? Everly's eyes darkened, his thin fingers curling into fists. What are you implying? Poirot's mustache twitched with faint amusement. I imply nothing, monsieur. I merely observe. The braid suggests a recent fitting, perhaps even an argument. Tell me, did you and Monsieur Dupont exchange words during your last visit? Perhaps over a matter of design, or perhaps over a matter of discretion. Everly's face flushed, his composure slipping for a moment as his eyes flicked once more to Lady Winthrop, who had taken another small, involuntary step back, her face pale beneath her flawless makeup. Japp, sensing the tension, took a step forward, his thick, calloused hands resting on his hips. Out with it, Everly. If you've got something to hide, now's the time to come clean. Everly's sharp eyes darted between the two men, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his thin frame sagging slightly as if the weight of his secrets had finally become too much to bear. Fine, he snapped, his voice low and bitter. Yes, I argued with Dupont, but it was not about the uniform. Poirot's eyes brightened, his head inclining slightly. Ah, and what, then, was the nature of this disagreement? Everly's thin lips twisted into a grimace. It was about a letter he had found, a letter that should never have existed. Lady Winthrop's breath caught, her gloved hand rising to her mouth as a faint, strangled sound escaped her lips. Poirot's sharp eyes flicked to her, noting the way her fingers trembled, the slight sway in her posture as if her polished exterior had begun to crack. A letter, Poirot repeated, his voice dropping to a soft murmur. And what precisely did this letter contain, monsieur? Everly hesitated, his eyes darting to the polished mirrors that lined the showroom, their gleaming surfaces reflecting his own haggard expression back at him. It contained matters of a personal nature, he said finally, his voice tight and strained. Matters that could ruin reputations if they became known. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle began to align. He stepped closer, his small, precise frame casting a long shadow across the polished floorboards. And this letter, did Monsieur Dupont threaten to reveal it? To use it against you? Everly's jaw tightened, his thin fingers clenching into fists once more. No, he whispered, his voice a low, bitter growl. No, he did not. But he hinted at it. He made it clear that he held the power to destroy me, to destroy us. Lady Winthrop let out a small, strangled sob, her polished exterior shattering as she collapsed into one of the low leather chairs, her head bowed, her shoulders trembling. Poirot's eyes remained fixed on Everly, his voice dropping to a soft, almost sympathetic tone. And so, monsieur, you came here today to silence him, to ensure that his secrets would never see the light of day. Is that not so? Everly's head snapped up, his sharp eyes flashing with sudden, desperate anger. No, I did not kill him. I merely sought to reason with him, to convince him to remain silent. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his sharp gaze cutting through the desperate protest like a blade. Ah, but monsieur, the truth, like a fine stitch, cannot be hidden forever, and I fear that your secrets, once revealed, will prove to be the very threads that unravel this entire affair. The small, polished showroom fell into a thick, suffocating silence, the air heavy with the weight of betrayal and fear. Poirot, his sharp mind racing, felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, the threads of his investigation tightening around the shadowed hearts of his suspects. The silence in the showroom thickened, the air heavy with the unspoken words that now hung between them. Lady Winthrop remained slumped in the leather chair, her gloved hands trembling as she fought to regain her composure. Richard Everley, his thin frame rigid with tension, stood like a cornered animal, his sharp eyes flicking from Poirot to Japp, then back again, as if calculating his chances of escape. Poirot, his sharp mind already moving several steps ahead, adjusted his cuffs with a small, precise motion, his eyes never leaving Everley's face. "Monsieur Everley," he said, his tone polite, yet edged with a steely resolve. "You say that you sought only to reason with Monsieur Dupont, to convince him to keep silent about this mysterious letter. Yet you must understand that a tailor like Dupont, meticulous, disciplined, a man of habit, would not be easily swayed by mere words." Everley's jaw tightened, his thin lips pressing into a tight line. "You do not understand," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "Dupont was more than just a tailor. He was a spider, weaving his web around the powerful and the vulnerable alike. He collected secrets, Monsieur Poirot, and used them to secure his own position." Poirot's dark eyes gleamed. "Ah, so you believe he was a blackmailer, no? A man who held power over his clients through the quiet, whispered knowledge of their private affairs." Everley's nostrils flared, his thin frame quivering with suppressed rage. "Yes, he threatened me. He threatened us." Lady Winthrop let out a small, choked sob, her gloved hand rising to cover her mouth. Poirot's sharp eyes flicked to her, noting the way her body trembled, the faint sheen of sweat on her pale brow. "But surely," Poirot continued, his voice soft and insistent, "if Dupont held such power, it would have been wise to tread carefully, no? To avoid provoking a man who might so easily ruin you?" Everley's thin fingers curled into fists, his eyes dark with bitter resentment. "I had no choice. The letter he found, it was a mistake, a foolish, reckless mistake. If it had become public, it would have destroyed everything. My career, my family's honor, everything." Poirot stepped closer, his polished shoes tapping softly against the oak floor. "And so, you confronted him. You demanded his silence, and when he refused—" Everley's sharp eyes darted to the side, his throat working as he swallowed against the rising tide of panic. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "I did not kill him. I swear it." Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the trembling man before him, his sharp mind already piecing together the fragments of truth that had begun to emerge. "Then perhaps, monsieur, you can explain why your initials appear on the cufflinks found beside Dupont's body. Cufflinks that, by all accounts, should have been in your possession." Everley's face paled, his thin frame swaying slightly as if the very floor beneath him had shifted. I do not know," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "Perhaps he meant to use them as a message, a threat." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind racing through the possibilities. He reached into his pocket, producing the small folded slip of paper he had discovered earlier. He unfolded it carefully, his sharp eyes scanning the neatly written lines before holding it up to the light. "Non, monsieur," Poirot said softly, his voice tinged with quiet certainty. "This is not merely a message. It is a clue, a thread in the fabric of this mystery, and I believe it leads directly to you." Everley's thin frame trembled, his sharp eyes wide with fear and disbelief. He opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot cut him off with a sharp, decisive motion. "Tell me, monsieur," Poirot continued, his voice dropping to a low, insistent murmur, "why did you not simply destroy the letter? Why leave it in Dupont's possession, where it might one day resurface to ruin you?" Everley's eyes flicked to Lady Winthrop, whose head remained bowed, her gloved hands clutching the edge of the leather chair with white-knuckled intensity. For a moment, the small, polished showroom seemed to hold its breath, the polished mannequins standing as silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Finally, Everly spoke, his voice hoarse and broken. I could not. The letter, it was not mine to destroy." Poirot's eyes sharpened, his head tilting slightly as he took a small, precise step closer. "Ah, but of course. The letter was not merely your secret, was it, monsieur? It was a shared secret, a secret that bound you and Lady Winthrop together in a web of deception." Lady Winthrop let out a small, strangled cry, her head snapping up, her dark eyes wide with fear and desperation. "No, you do not understand. It was a mistake, a foolish, reckless mistake, but it was not murder." Poirot's gaze softened slightly, his sharp eyes flicking between the two trembling figures before him. "Ah, madame," he said gently, his voice tinged with quiet sympathy, "I believe you. Truly I do. But you must understand that secrets, once revealed, have a way of unraveling even the most carefully woven lives, and I fear that this particular thread may lead us to a truth far darker than you have yet admitted." Lady Winthrop's trembling frame seemed to sag, her polished facade crumbling as the weight of her guilt pressed down upon her. Everly, his thin frame rigid with tension, seemed to shrink into himself, his sharp eyes flicking desperately between Poirot and the door, as if considering a sudden flight from the polished, suffocating confines of the showroom. Poirot, his sharp mind racing, felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, the threads of his investigation tightening around the shadowed hearts of his suspects. He took a slow, deliberate step back, his eyes never leaving the trembling figures before him. "Come, my friends," he said softly, his voice tinged with quiet certainty. "It is time we spoke of the truth, the whole truth." The small, polished showroom fell into a thick, suffocating silence, the air heavy with the weight of betrayal and fear. And in that moment, Poirot knew that he had taken the first true step toward unraveling the tangled threads of deception that bound his suspects together. Poirot allowed the silence to settle around them, his sharp eyes flicking between the trembling Lady Winthrop and the rigid, panicked form of Richard Everly. He took a slow, measured step back, his polished shoes tapping softly against the oak floor, his small frame exuding an air of quiet control. "Lady Winthrop," he said gently, his voice tinged with a note of compassion, "you must understand that the truth, once set free, has a way of asserting itself, no matter how carefully it has been hidden. If you wish to avoid further disaster, now is the time to speak openly." The woman's head snapped up, her dark eyes glistening with unshed tears, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat, her gloved hands clutching the arms of the leather chair with white-knuckled intensity. Everly, his sharp eyes darting nervously between Poirot and Japp, took a small, unsteady step back, his thin frame trembling with barely contained fear. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse and desperate. "You do not understand. You cannot possibly understand." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his sharp mind already piecing together the final threads of the tangled web that had ensnared his suspects. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving Everly's pale, stricken face. "Ah, but I do understand, monsieur," Poirot said softly, his voice dropping to a low, insistent murmur. "I understand that you and Lady Winthrop share a secret that Monsieur Dupont discovered and which he sought to use to his advantage. But what you do not yet see, what you have not yet admitted, is the true nature of the bond that ties you together." Everly's sharp eyes widened, his thin lips parting in a silent, desperate protest, but Poirot cut him off with a sharp, decisive motion. "Tell me, monsieur," Poirot continued, his voice tightening with quiet intensity, "why did you not simply destroy the letter? Why leave it in Dupont's possession, where it might one day resurface to ruin you?" Everly's throat worked as he swallowed against the rising tide of panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to die on his tongue, his sharp eyes flicking desperately to Lady Winthrop, whose trembling frame had begun to sag beneath the weight of her secrets. "Because," Poirot said softly, his eyes gleaming with sudden, terrible understanding, "the letter was not merely a threat to you, monsieur. It was a threat to both of you. It was a letter that bound you together in a web of deception and betrayal. A letter that, if revealed, would have destroyed not only your career, but also the reputation of a woman of noble standing." Lady Winthrop let out a small strangled cry, her head snapping up, her dark eyes wide with fear and desperation. "No, you do not understand. It was a mistake, a foolish, reckless mistake. But it was not murder." Poirot's gaze softened slightly, his sharp eyes flicking between the two trembling figures before him. "Ah, madame," he said gently, his voice tinged with quiet sympathy. "I believe you, truly I do. But you must understand that secrets, once revealed, have a way of unraveling even the most carefully woven lives, and I fear that this particular thread may lead us to a truth far darker than you have yet admitted." Lady Winthrop's trembling frame seemed to sag, her polished facade crumbling as the weight of her guilt pressed down upon her. Everly, his thin frame rigid with tension, seemed to shrink into himself, his sharp eyes flicking desperately between Poirot and the door, as if considering a sudden flight from the polished, suffocating confines of the showroom. Japp, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, his broad, muscular frame casting a long shadow across the polished floorboards. "Out with it, Everly," he growled, his thick hands clenching into fists at his sides. "If you've got something to hide, now's the time to come clean." Everly's thin frame seemed to crumple, his sharp shoulders sagging as if the very air around him had grown too heavy to bear. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his eyes closing for a brief, tortured moment before snapping open once more, his thin lips twisting into a bitter, self-loathing smile. "Fine," he whispered, his voice thin and broken. "You want the truth? Here it is. I did not kill Dupont, but I did have reason to fear him. We both did." Lady Winthrop let out a small, choked sob, her gloved hands clutching the arms of the leather chair with renewed intensity. Poirot's sharp eyes flicked to her, noting the way her body trembled, the faint sheen of sweat on her pale brow. "Explain," Poirot said softly, his voice tinged with quiet urgency. "What hold did Dupont have over you? What secret did he threaten to reveal?" Everly's thin frame swayed slightly, his sharp eyes dark with bitter resentment. "The letter," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "It contained a confession of love." Lady Winthrop let out a small, strangled cry, her head snapping up, her dark eyes wide with shock and horror. "No," she gasped, her voice thin and desperate. "No, Richard, you must not—" But Everly cut her off with a sharp, bitter laugh, his thin frame trembling with the weight of his confession. "It is too late, my dear. The truth is out. There is no hiding it now." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his sharp mind racing through the final pieces of the puzzle that had begun to fall into place. "A confession of love," he repeated softly, his voice tinged with quiet understanding. "A confession that, if revealed, would have destroyed your reputations, your careers, everything you had worked so hard to build." Lady Winthrop let out a small, strangled sob, her head bowing once more as the weight of her guilt pressed down upon her. Everly, his thin frame trembling with barely contained rage and despair, took a small, unsteady step back, his sharp eyes flicking desperately between Poirot and the door. Poirot, his sharp mind already several steps ahead, felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, the threads of his investigation tightening around the shadowed hearts of his suspects. He took a slow, deliberate step back, his eyes never leaving the trembling figures before him. "Come, my friends," he said softly, his voice tinged with quiet certainty. "It is time we spoke of the truth, the whole truth. The small, polished showroom fell into a thick, suffocating silence, the air heavy with the weight of betrayal and fear. And in that moment, Poirot knew that he had taken the first true step toward unraveling the tangled threads of deception that bound his suspects together. Lady Winthrop sat motionless, as if frozen by the very weight of her memories. Her eyes, once sharp and commanding, had dulled into a hollow sort of resignation. Richard Everley stood beside her, pale and silent now, as though all his energy had been drained by the confession he had allowed to surface. The air inside the showroom was stifling, laden with the tension of half-spoken truths and the unspeakable knowledge that something darker than scandal hung just out of reach. Poirot remained standing, his hands gently clasped behind his back, as his gaze flicked with mathematical precision between the two figures before him. His voice, when it came, was quiet but unyielding. "Monsieur Everley, Lady Winthrop, I thank you both for your candor, but now we must move further, beyond the sentiment, beyond the shame. Because I believe that your shared secret, while scandalous, is not the only thing Monsieur Dupont had discovered." Japp shifted beside Poirot, arms folded across his chest. "And what makes you so sure of that, Poirot?" Poirot tilted his head. "Because Dupont's death bears the mark not of passion, but of calculation. His body was carefully arranged, propped almost theatrically with the shears beside him. That is not the gesture of someone overcome by rage. It is, rather, someone attempting to tell a story, n'est-ce pas? And we must ask, who benefits from that story being believed?" He turned back to Everley, who blinked slowly, as if only now understanding that the confession he'd offered might not absolve him, but implicate someone else entirely. "It wasn't me," he said quietly, but the conviction was weak. "I was afraid of Dupont, yes, but murder? No." "And yet," Poirot said, pacing a slow semicircle around the pair, "you admitted you knew about the letter, that Dupont had used it against you, and you knew he had enemies, not just in you, but among the staff, even among his clients." "Everyone despised him," Lady Winthrop whispered, her voice hoarse with fatigue. "He had a way of sniffing out a person's weakness, then collecting it." Poirot nodded. "Just so. He was not content merely to tailor garments. He tailored lives, adjusted them, pressed them, hemmed them into silence." He turned toward Japp. "I believe it is time to revisit those who stood closest to Dupont. We must speak again with Monsieur Ashcroft." Within half an hour, the quiet assistant was brought into the showroom. This time, he carried himself with less ease than before. There was a tightness around his mouth and a defensive stoop to his shoulders. Poirot greeted him with a faint nod. "Monsieur Ashcroft, you are a man of habits, are you not? A man who observes?" Ashcroft blinked. "Yes, I suppose so. Mr. Dupont demanded consistency. Everything had to be done just so." "Indeed," Poirot said smoothly. "And that included the arrangement of tools, yes?" "Of course." "Then answer me this, s'il vous plaît. When you found Monsieur Dupont's body, the shears were in his hand, but were they the shears he preferred?" Ashcroft frowned. I didn't think about it at the time. They were his, but now that you mention it, no. He always used a gold-handled pair for cutting wool, kept them by the mirror in the side cabinet. And were those gold-handled shears where they belonged?" Ashcroft paused. "No, I found them later, on the fabric table, under a piece of muslin." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, then it is as I suspected. Someone switched the shears, either to mislead us, or because they used them and did not wish us to know." Japp scowled. "So we're back to the tools again." Poirot raised a finger. "Non, mon ami. We are back to the psychology. Let me ask one final question of you, Monsieur Ashcroft. On the day of the murder, did Dupont receive any unexpected visitors?" Ashcroft hesitated. "Well, there was someone who came in briefly. I didn't think much of it at the time. A client, Mrs. Ambrose. Normally, she sees me first. But that morning, she went straight to Mr. Dupont's office. Poirot's brow furrowed. She did not pause to be announced? No, she was brisk. Unusually so. She said she'd forgotten her umbrella the previous day and it would only take a moment. Poirot exchanged a swift glance with Japp. Then, Inspector, we must now speak to Madame Ambrose, immediately. It was not long before Mrs. Ambrose, poised and still dressed in mourning black, returned to the showroom. She seemed collected, but Poirot noted the minute tightening around her eyes as she was ushered into the room. She glanced between Poirot and Japp with the air of someone who had long considered herself beyond reproach. "You asked to see me again," she said coolly. Poirot inclined his head. "Yes, madame. I must clarify one small inconsistency. You stated in your first interview that your last appointment with Monsieur Dupont was 2 days before his death, and yet we have now learned that you visited him the very morning he was killed. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Mrs. Ambrose faltered. Yes, I did stop by, but only for a moment. It didn't seem worth mentioning. I'd left my umbrella behind." "And did you speak to him?" Poirot asked. "A few words, nothing more." "But that was not your only reason for the visit, was it?" She frowned. "I beg your pardon." Poirot stepped closer. "Madame, let us not dance around the truth. You were being blackmailed by Monsieur Dupont." The color drained from her face. What proof do you have of that?" "I do not need proof, madame," Poirot said calmly. "I only need motive, and I believe yours was greater than any other. Dupont knew something that could ruin you. Perhaps an indiscretion, perhaps a secret from the past, and when you arrived that morning, you had no intention of retrieving an umbrella." Her composure cracked. "He deserved it," she hissed suddenly, eyes flashing. "He thought he could control everyone, hold us all in the palm of his hand. But I wouldn't let him. I couldn't. He was going to expose everything." "And so," Poirot said softly, "you struck him with the shears he had used minutes before. But the sight of what you had done, it frightened you. And so you tried to rearrange the scene to make it look like suicide or misadventure. Only you did it too carefully." Japp stepped forward, pulling out his notebook. "Mrs. Ambrose, I must caution you, anything you say may be used in evidence." She sagged suddenly, as though every bone in her body had melted beneath the weight of relief and ruin. "It's over, then," she murmured. "All of it." Poirot stepped back, and his eyes, though stern, betrayed a flicker of sadness. "It is a tragedy, madame, but one of your own making." Outside, the clouds broke at last, spilling sunlight across the pavement. Inside the showroom, silence reigned, but it was no longer tense, only tired. Japp stepped forward to take Mrs. Ambrose into custody, and Poirot, with great care, began to straighten the scissors on the table. Precision, always. The rain had stopped entirely by the following morning, leaving London hushed and washed clean beneath a slate-grey sky. Inside the Winthrop showroom, the scent of pressed wool and polished wood still lingered, but the mood had shifted. Less foreboding now, more solemn. Word of Mrs. Ambrose's arrest had begun to ripple quietly through the fashionably discreet clientele, and the grand establishment, once known for garments and gossip, now sat in silence like a stage awaiting its final act. In the drawing-room above the showroom, the key figures gathered under Poirot's quiet summons. Richard Everley stood near the hearth, visibly anxious but obedient to the detective's request. Lady Winthrop, regal but paler than usual, was seated stiffly on a settee. Arthur Ashcroft hovered by the door like a man who feared being asked to perform and wished only to vanish into the wallpaper. Chief Inspector Japp leaned against the window frame, his arms crossed, observing everything with a mixture of suspicion and weary patience. Poirot, immaculate as ever, stood in the center of the room with the air of a man about to orchestrate a symphony. His eyes scanned the room, resting a beat longer on each face than might be comfortable. Then, in his measured, gently accented voice, he began. Mesdames et messieurs, I have asked you here so that we may lay bare the truth behind the death of Monsieur Dupont. It is not enough to name the culprit. One must understand the design of the crime, the subtle folds and seams hidden beneath its surface. N'est-ce pas? He turned slightly, addressing Lady Winthrop. Let us begin with the letter. Yes, Madame, Dupont had it. And yes, he used it as leverage to secure your silence. But in truth, his scheme extended far beyond one affair. He discovered secrets in all of you, and he stored them like a miser hoards gold. And like gold, he used them to exert control. Lady Winthrop stared ahead, her jaw tight, her silence confirming all. Poirot gestured toward Everly. Monsieur Everly, you feared exposure, perhaps ruin, but though your emotional state made you vulnerable, it did not drive you to murder. No, someone else acted with cold purpose. He began to pace slowly, hands behind his back. We know now that Mrs. Ambrose visited the showroom on the morning of Dupont's death. She claimed it was for an umbrella, but in truth she had received an ultimatum from Dupont. Pay, or he would reveal an incident from her past that would destroy both her social standing and her family. What that secret was, I do not claim to know precisely, but its power over her was immense. Japp interjected. She confessed, but she never explained exactly what Dupont was holding over her. Poirot gave a subtle shrug. Perhaps she will in time, or perhaps the shame will remain locked away, but the fact remains. Her intent was not to negotiate. She had made up her mind. He stopped pacing and faced the group directly. She brought the gold-handled shears with her into his office. Perhaps she meant only to threaten him. But something was said, a final insult, a taunt, and in that moment she struck. It was not rage, but panic that followed. She rearranged the scene, thinking to stage it as an accident or suicide. But as always, the truth lies in the details. He turned to Ashcroft. Monsieur Ashcroft, your testimony was vital. The shears found in Dupont's hand were not his preferred pair. Only someone unfamiliar with his meticulous preferences would make such an error. Ashcroft nodded slowly. I didn't notice it immediately, but yes, he always used the gold-handled pair for wool. Poirot clasped his hands. Voila. That inconsistency was the first thread that unraveled the lie. There was a pause, filled only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Then Japp said, So that's it? A blackmailer got what was coming to him. Not the first time that's happened. Poirot frowned gently. Non, mon ami. Let us not reduce it to something so simple. Yes, Dupont was cruel. He manipulated those around him with surgical precision. But what fascinates me is not the crime, it is the architecture of guilt, the way it builds, brick by brick. He walked to the window and looked out, his tone quieter now. Consider, if you will, the pattern that Dupont followed. He found beauty in weakness, not to mend it, but to use it. He stitched lies into the very lives of his clients, the way he stitched fabric. When those lies were pulled tight, when they began to suffocate, someone snapped. He turned back to the room. Mrs. Ambrose was not a cold-blooded killer. She was a woman trapped in a web she did not fully understand until it was too late. And yet, she chose violence, and for that, she must face justice. He stepped away from the window and retrieved his gloves from a small side table. As for the rest of you, you are free of Dupont now. But ask yourselves, was it he who held power, or the secrets you gave him? There is no blackmail where there is no shame. He smiled faintly, almost sorrowfully. In the end, it was not a love affair, nor a lost opportunity, nor a ruined family that caused his death. It was pride, his own and hers. Japp cleared his throat and pushed off the window. Well, it's neat, I'll give you that. Can't say I'll miss the man, but justice is justice. Poirot bowed slightly. Indeed. And now, Inspector, I leave the remaining tasks in your capable hands. For me, I have an appointment with a tailor in Brussels who, I assure you, keeps scissors only where scissors belong." Lady Winthrop stood suddenly. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for your discretion and your clarity." He offered her a warm, polite nod. "Madame, I ask only one thing in return: honesty. It is not only a virtue, but a safeguard against tragedy." With that, he turned, straightened his cuffs, and walked out, his polished shoes tapping softly down the stairwell. As the door closed behind him, the silence returned. But it was no longer suffocating. It was the silence of an ending, a well-sewn seam, invisible to the eye, but holding everything in place.